Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Sarah, you've been very
I would say I could possibly argue against you that Lord of the Flies might be quite an accurate portrayal of what will happen to boys who've been brought up in the British public school system. But that is a debating point, otherwise I absolutely agree with you about it. What I was going to say was what I would expect might well happen within climate change is a bit what happened about nuclear, or we will get the Armageddon scenarios as the background of all sorts of fiction, almost first. But there are quite a lot of books and television and stuff like that that are about environmental crimes. I mean, there's a very good book for 3 and 4 year olds by David McKee called Dinosaurs and All That Rubbish. It's a brilliant book. It's a wonderful book, and I think children are probably more influenced about the probabilities of climate change than adults, and unfortunately they're going to inherit the world that will be something. There's a detective story writer that I quite like, Donna Leone, and a lot of her books have at the heart an environmental crime, a crime of pollution for the sake of profit, this kind of thing, that is quite effective. No, I absolutely agree with you that fiction isn't going to change the world, but I do think that it's one of the many ways in which individuals can be deeply influenced. There was a television series about oil in Nigeria, for instance, which was quite, it was a run-of-the-mill thriller, if you like. It was nothing particular, but it was absolutely about environmental crime, and again, what's sacrifice of profit. So I think there's more about than people might realise. I suddenly found Oryx and Crake was the first Margaret Atwood I read not long ago. It's what my granddaughter told me to start on, so I did. I found it most unsettling, and I found it forever reminiscent of Aldous Huxley. It's a very, very brave new world. And I think it, any book that makes you think, that stirs you up, that makes you uneasy, is part of performing a service and part of countering the inevitable constant stream of assumption that, well, of course, in the current economic situation we can't do anything about the green agenda, so let's drop it.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of it is just to do with any books that have ideas in them that are about certain things. I mean, this is why one of the reasons I like The Lord of the Flies is because it allows one to have those discussions, and it's such an you don't have to agree with it. So the mere fact that these things, as you say, that they might be using environmental crimes as a backdrop or whatever, it's hardly going to be pulling against against a kind of progressive direction, even if it's just a question of allowing people to talk about these things. There is, though, I think, a slight danger with this, which is this notion of... I mean, I don't disagree with anything you've said. The only thing I would add, though, is that there is sometimes a notion, sometimes on the left as well, of fiction or art as being relevant, and anytime anyone talks about relevance, I start to get very twitchy, because it's this extremely kind of reductive notion about what it's almost like a kind of badge of bona fides that to be permissible it has to be relevant, and relevant is normally a very kind of narrow notion of reflection, and is also, I mean, it was one of Blairism's favourite words, which is another reason to hate it, but I'll give you an example in terms of climate change. Recently there's been a fair bit of interest in J.G. Ballard's novel The Drowned World, which, I don't know if anyone's read it, is an absolutely staggeringly brilliant piece of visionary fiction, set in London, underwater. when it's all lagoons and stuff. And a lot of the reissues recently have said, this chilling vision that very presciently saw the oncoming climate change and a stark ecological warning. Now, I'm sorry, there are many things you can say about that book, including that it's a genius work of art, but that it's a warning of climate change is not one of them. Ballard is completely uninterested in this book in the science, or frankly the politics and economics of climate change. It's just not what he's doing. He's using it as a kind of psychic, visionary dreamscape and so on. Now that's fine. It's a fantastic book, but I fear that part of the notion that to make it relevant we have to say it's about climate change, and that's if you like the flip side of what we're talking about. That's the kind of reductive thing which I actually think does the book no favours at all.
The thing about relevance reminds me of when I was a student. I wrote a play that went through to the National Student Drama Festival and was reviewed in the Sunday Times.
Wow.
And they said it groaned with contemporary significance.
Wonderful.
Anybody else like to come in? Lots. I'm going to come back.
It's that balance, and two examples that I think have worked recently in that I've heard conversations from people who would never go to a political meeting but have been really touched. I went to hear the Palestinian doctor, I wish I could remember his name to pronounce it, Abu Sayyid Isai, I've got his book, I Will Not Hate, whose four daughters were killed. In the queue to get his book and the signing, I overheard 3 young girls in their early 20s who'd seen The Promise on television, talking to an elderly Jewish lady, and the conversation was wonderful because she was obviously pro-Israel. They had seen that, but she'd seen The Promise as well. No, obvious from what she was saying, I meant. And basically, if you'd heard the conversation, she acknowledged herself as pro-Israel. I wasn't making a judgment on what somebody looked like. and basically, to hear them discussing it from 2 very different angles was wonderful. I didn't join the conversation. I was lovely to hear it. And that would not have happened, I think, if both parties, as it were, had not seen the same television series of plays. And similarly, I was part of discussions at the Tricycle when the game was shown, the Great Game, because, again, people went to that who would not dream of going to a political meeting, but were touched by. So I think in both those cases, it worked on both levels, both as the art and as, if you like, I hate to use the word message because I agree with you, social realism as far as I'm concerned never worked. But there is that balance, and I'm wondering when somebody, and perhaps it's done and I don't know about it, but I went to the Science Museum a few years ago and heard a scientist, very apolitical, but by the time he'd finished his lecture on the water wars, I was chilled to my bone, and it just struck me, there's a theme where you could do a damn good story, but also, there's a huge message.
Well, I don't know if you saw the last Bond film. The last Bond film is all about the water wars.
Is it?
Yeah,
What's
the
it
Daniel
called?
Craig.
What's the last one?
Quantum of Solace, bizarrely.
I didn't see it. I was wandering out.
Yeah, it's Bond's red moment. It's a very odd film indeed, and it's all about the basically privatised water wars.
Oh, right. Oh, so did it work on that level?
Well, it had some good gun chases in it. I don't know, like did I come away radicalised? I went in radicalised, so skewing the curve a bit. I honestly don't know. I do take your point, and I don't want to. You're absolutely right, and there can be these lovely conjunctions where people can want to talk about issues that they wouldn't. They would never watch a documentary about. About Israel in '48, for example, but they do watch. I totally accept that. I think in a way I always want to sound notes of caution because it seems to me that for the most part the discourse inflates the impact of fiction and art and so on. So I always want to sound a caution, but that isn't to suggest that it can't have these lovely moments such as the ones you're describing. And I also think that even if, as long as you're approaching it as art, as fiction, as movies or whatever, both as a sort of as the consumer of them and also as the producer of them, not only is there nothing wrong with wanting to put some politics in there, that can be very inspiring to you. I mean, loads of my favourite novels are very political, and I enjoy agreeing with them or disagreeing with them or whatever. And sometimes the passion that gets embedded into a book because of the politics of it is part of what makes it a great book, irrespective of whether or not you agree with it. So I don't think that, not only do I not think there's anything wrong with trying to kind of explore these ideas in art, I think it's partly what can make for great art. Part of the difficulty though is that you can, great passions can come from positions that we don't agree with.
Yes.
And this is where Lovecraft is an interesting example. I mean, for me, I mean, he's not to everyone's taste, but to me, the passion and the kind of hallucinatory fervour that I find very affecting in his novels, in his short stories, is inextricable from his racism. There's no two ways about it, and you just have to kind of mediate that.
Carol.
The weird thing about Lovecraft is, I don't know if you knew this, but his wife was a Jewish person.
I did know that.
I find that, and yeah, I have to say that Lovecraft, I used to think he was wonderful. Somebody got me to read Lovecraft, and I really felt let down when I realised he was an out and out fascist. But the reason I put my hand up is I told my brother I was coming to your lecture, and I heard my sister-in-law, who I can't stand, I have to admit, in the background, mention the Jerry Cornelius novels. Mention Jerry Cornelius. I don't know what he's got to do with climate change, or no, this is Michael Moorcock. Yeah. Mention them. Very important. Are they? Is it?
Well, they are very important. I'm trying to think what the climate change issues would be. There's nothing that's leaping to my mind at some time since I've read them. I mean, it's definitely true that questions of, we didn't invent the politics of ecology in the last 10 years. And I think in the early 70s and late 60s, it was becoming very much a kind of cutting-edge issue for a lot. And Moorcock was around a lot of those radical movements. So it may very well be that there are ecological things filtered, and knowing Michael Moorcock, I would imagine from a pretty left perspective, but I can't remember specific things.
But you say he was on the left. He was, of course, a great friend of Lemmy, Lemmy Motorhead. So I think he flirted with both sides of the political.
I don't think that's fair. I think Moorcock has never flirted with the far right. What is true is, he's a left anarchist. I hold no, the problem with, he likes provocateurs. And I'm not defending this. I get very exasperated when, rockers and so on sport swastikas to sort of try and, you remember Susie and the Banshees did it back in the day, although I think to be fair they had the grace to apologise, as I recall, but anyway. I
think there was a post-modern argument, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, is it, I just...
Designification.
I don't think Moorcock has, I don't think he's ever, not everyone...
It's the imagery, isn't it? Yeah.
Sorry?
It's the imagery.
Yeah, well, the tricky thing is that also, and this actually gets to some of these issues, that, on the one hand, you can't, he hung out with some, it was a very sort of extreme time, and there was a lot of this kind of provocation flipped over into the sort of far right in a way that was pretty problematic. But there's also the question of extreme literature, and I don't know if people know, there's a book called Lord Horror, which is like the last book banned under the Obscene Publications Act, and the writer went to jail, or the publisher went to jail for something. This is in the late 80s, it was extremely recently, and it's a kind of extreme, vivid, surrealist, rambling, nightmare vision of Nazism. And it's based around this conceit that William Joyce, Lord Haw-Haw, lives on after the war and becomes this kind of sort of like a far-right Jerry Cornelius figure, this kind of foppish, murderous aesthete who wanders around killing Jews and having sex. And it's written very much in a kind of post-surrealist idiom, so it's extremely violent, extremely sexual, extremely difficult. And it's the kind of work of art that really, really divides the left, because on the one hand, you know, it is absolutely saturated with this kind of fascist imagery in a very kind of libidinally invested way and so on. And at the same time, you know, if you think about the surrealists, you think about, you know, some of the avant-garde in the 30s was doing exactly the same thing from a kind of, you know, from a kind of a critical position. I think you can only kind of make a judgment case by case, and sometimes, you know, the writer or the artist's desires and opinions are not going to be, you know, a book may run away from them. They may come at it with absolute integrity, but the fact is there's something about the aesthetic which just sort of becomes too kind of invested or whatever. This is relevant for climate change, I think, because in a very, very small way, there's definitely something about the way in modern, sort of particularly films, there's this kind of loving apocalypse that we've started to see. There's a certain kind of slightly creepy over-investment in the end of the world, you know. So
it's been there for a long time.
And it's always done as this kind of Jeremiah. It's always done as kind of, you know, it justifies itself by saying it's a warning. You know, if we don't mend our ways, we're going to be living in this beautiful ruinscape, you know, and it's kind of like, even if you don't end our ways, you can't wait to get there. Look at this, you know. So this question of the way the aesthetics sometimes pull against even the conscious intent. I mean, I don't think that the writer of Lord Horror, I mean, you know, I absolutely know he wasn't a Nazi, and you know, the question of what, you know, just to take that extreme example, the question of whether or not the aesthetics can run away from your intent is an open question, and that's, you know, one has to have a kind of, if you're on the left, I think you have to be prepared to have a very serious but not closed-minded debate about it. And I think you know, simply because a piece of art makes us uncomfortable isn't necessarily a reason for us to sort of, you know, denounce it or whatever. But at the same time, you know, it's, and yeah, so.
Brian, come back.
I've got a very simple question, but it's quite difficult to put diplomatically.
Don't be diplomatic. You can be as rude as you wish.
Are you aware of the Dark Mountain Project?
The Dark Mountain Project? No.
Right. The floor is mine. And I'll be condescending before I take the floor. I think you should know about it. It's a bunch of writers and other artists, you know, people who write poetry, etc., who became very, very concerned 2 or 3 years ago about climate change, and they all went together, quite large numbers of them, up the side of a mountain in Wales, and they put their heads together to see if they could come up with some common approaches, common understanding of what might be the role of writers et al. In doing something, communicating with the public, that might actually help to address the problem. I've forgotten the name of the guy, but he did have in The Guardian a very long punch-up with George Monbiot, because George Monbiot's position was essentially, yes, there's a very big, tough problem there, but at bottom I'm optimistic, and this other guy was saying, no, we agree there's a big problem, but at the moment I can't see us solving it. And so this other guy went off up on the top of his mountain and got some fellows around him. And I don't know what the outcome is, other than there is a Dark Mountain website.
I'll look it up. I'm just making a note of that. I've learned if I don't make notes of things instantly, they slip my mind. So thank you for the heads up. I'll chase that up. That sounds very interesting. And I mean, the fact is, you know, whether one's optimistic or not, you know, some of my favourite art comes from people who are much more politically pessimistic than I am, because there's something about kind of, you know, sort of, there's something about nihilism that sometimes leads to pretty impressive art, in my opinion, even if you disagree with it politically. So I'll take a look at that. Thank you.
China, I'd like to ask you a more personal question, getting slightly away from the conversation. When I read The City and the City, I was absolutely astonished with the conceptualisation, the way you had this amazing concept, and not only carried it through the novel, but were able to spark off and generate further ideas from that central concept. The question really is what then makes you tick? I mean, in a way, you've spent a lot of time talking about the different things that don't make you tick. What is the starting point? I mean, not everybody has read The City and the City, but just in terms of your fantastic concepts, what is the starting point? I mean, my take on life is righteous indignation. I'm an angry old bastard, and therefore I'm a revolutionary socialist. You're a revolutionary socialist as well. What actually gets you going? Where do you get that initial spark?
Well, I mean, it depends book to book. I mean, sometimes it is very political. I mean, Iron Council, which is another of the books, and City and the City, part of the driver was definitely political. I mean,
What do you think of parallel cities? Actual cities on Earth which have two regimes.
Not really. No, it was more to do with. This won't make any sense to anyone who hasn't read the book, but it's about borders basically, and it was much more to do with kind of general questions of political borders and boundaries. And I mean, this is why, in answer to, is it Anne? Sorry, was saying that, because what motivates me is very much political, so I can always see the politics that got me, with Iron Council there was a question about the representation of revolution. In The City and the City there was a question about the murderous yet arbitrary nature of borders. In Embassy Town, it's something to do with a kind of intersection of semiotics and colonialism. I can always see those things, but I don't. But it kind of tends to be mediated in my case through a predilection for the grotesque. In general, if I had to say one thing, I guess it's probably something to do with estrangement. I get very motivated by something that estranges me from the everyday, which is very different from escapism, I think, because it's a much more direct kind of pulling against the grain. That's sort of what kind of gets me up in the morning, I think. I think that's probably what it is for me. And then different specifics for the different books. I was having a conversation with someone over the weekend, and I think that there's a kind of distinction between art which is predicated on recognition and art which is predicated on estrangement. And on the whole, I'm much more interested in the latter, both as a producer and as a consumer. There's art that you read or to take fiction that makes you go, yes, that's right. And then there's the other stuff that you read that makes you go, oh my God, wow, and I'm much more interested in the latter, I think. But that is at least in my case, it's definitely because of politics. It's not unrelated to the politics.
Time for one last question, I think.
Are there any special mental attitudes you have to adopt when you're consciously writing for children and young people?
No. There's a slightly different relationship to the fantastic, I would say. I think there's a difference in the way there's something to do with a kind of a literalised verbal fantastic that you can get away with, and that if you think about the difference between Tolkien's fantastic and Lewis Carroll's fantastic, so in the latter case you have stuff like kind of literalised puns, which don't work so much for the audience. But beyond that, I think if you sort of police yourself too much, you're probably going to be talking down and patronising, and that's the worst thing you can do. So, not at a conscious level, no. I mean, I think it's a very boring answer, but basically, you're kind of writing for your own 9-year-old self, really. So whatever got you going was what you would.
Well, that is a follow-up question, isn't it? Did Anne London engage you in the way your other novels engage you?
Oh God, yeah. I wouldn't have written it otherwise. I think writing. No, I mean, I think if you're not engaged with it, it would be disastrous. And I think there is something about the way young readers. I mean, this is like your point about dinosaurs and all that rubbish. I mean, that's obviously for very young readers, but there's something about the way young readers inhabit books that no matter how much I love a book now, I know that I don't live in it in the same way as I did a book that I loved when I was 8 or 9. And I think for me, partly writing on London was well, partly it was a homage to books like Lewis Carroll and The Phantom Tollbooth and, you know, and Joan Aiken and those kind of classics of my youth, but it was also partly this kind of wistful notion of having a book that someone inhabits in that way is extremely moving. I think there is something specific about reading as a child. This is why I'm quite sceptical about the category young adult. I mean, they use it as a marketing category, and I mean, I don't kick up a stink if that's what they want to do, fine. But I think there is a difference between the way children read and the way adults read. You know, with a hazy line, and there's something about the kind of passion and total surrender with which children read, which is really a kind of invigorating and kind of awesome, actually. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was going through my list of desert island books. And the expectation, or certainly the hope, that they'd nearly all be very specifically political writers, people like Swift, who's of course top of the list. It turns out that's not the case, but they're all nasty people. But China's not a nasty person, and I think it's led a really interesting conversation this evening, so I'm sure you'd like to show your appreciation.
I want to know who your desert island books are now. I'm fascinated. Yeah.
Well, actually, you know, there's something about nasty people actually very often do make great writers, because the contradictions are all there, aren't they? Anyway, that's it. Our next public meeting is on November the 12th on food, floods and climate change, and if you've left your name, you'll get details about that meeting.
The Saturday.
So November the 10th. Not 12th, 10th. There's another London conference on similar issues. Two London conferences on
I
similar
like
issues.
what you said about children,
Yeah.
because The City and the City is the first book, I think, since I was a child that I actually read crossing the road and going down the escalator. And
Deeply honoured.
I felt moved to send you an email to
You
say
sent me a
that.
lovely message. No, thank you. No, I'm really honoured.
Absolutely.
And I've never read any of your books, but after listening to you, I will.
Oh, you should.
I will.
And China promised me a complimentary copy of Embassy Town, I think. There's a